Welcome to the 2024 Anthony Drexel Biddle Lecture in International Studies. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, a Duke faculty and director of the Rethinking Diplomacy project, supported by the Trent Memorial Endowment Fund. The Biddle Lecture was established by Mary Duke Biddle, Trent Siemens, and James Siemens and their family to honor Mrs. Siemens' father, who had a distinguished career as a diplomat in the service of the United States and was an original signer of the Duke Endowment. The series is made possible by the Anthony Drexel Biddle Lectureship Endowment, by the Mary Trent Jones, Sarah Trent Harris, Rebecca Trent Kierland Endowment. This lecture symbolizes Duke University's continuing commitment to promoting international understanding and public service. Today's lecture is the 16th Biddle Lecture. I've organized, including today's, the last 5 Biddle Lectures. The last 2 speakers were Ambassador Nick Burns, who is currently the US Ambassador to China, and the Honorable Liz Grande, who is the President of the Peace Foundation. The topic of this year's lecture is very much in alignment with the Duke Climate Commitment and also with the Duke Centennial. Ambassador Biddle was an original signer of the Duke Endowment. So it's a very great year to have a Biddle lecture. The program of today's lecture is as follows. Ms. Mary Duke Biddle Trent Jones will share some memories about her grandfather, Ambassador Biddle, and then Ambassador Bob Pearson, former US Ambassador to Turkey, a former Director General of the US State Department, and a fellow at the Rethinking Diplomacy Program, will introduce our distinguished speaker, the Honorable Monica Medina. Ms. Medina will deliver her initial remarks, followed by a conversation with Ambassador Pearson and with all of you. So there are going to be microphones that are going to be used during the Q&A session. A special thank you to Anna Linville, Brianna Elliott, and Harrison Schreiber for helping to organize this year's lecture. And to the Sanford School of Public Policy, the Program in American Grand Strategy, the Office of Global Affairs, the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, and the Ocean Diplomacy Working Group. Thank you very much for being here, and Mary.
Can you all see me back there if I don't get on this stool? So thanks all of you for being here. On behalf of my family, it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to the Anthony Joseph Drexel Biddle Lecture, especially because my mother, Mary Siemens, took great pride in this lecture series that it honored her father and his service to our nation. Tony Biddle was a style trendsetter and sportsman. He was a superb tennis player and at one time was champion of France. And like his father, he was a boxer. In the November 2017 issue of Town and Country magazine, there was an article on grandfather calling him an American-style icon. My mother remembers him on his way to work, putting 2 red carnations together and pulling them through his lapel. Tony Biddle loved to tell jokes, had a great laugh, and did not know a stranger. But grandfather's life changed. He served in World War I, entering as an Army private, rising to the rank of captain. He then realized what serving his country meant to him, as it had to his father, and thus began his life of service. In 1935, he was appointed as Minister of Norway by President Roosevelt, and then in 1937, the President appointed him as Ambassador to Poland. Mother told us that when Hitler's forces moved into Warsaw, he worked to help Poles leave with him, saving their lives. After this, in 1941, he became Deputy Ambassador to France. Following this, he became ambassador to the countries in exile, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Greece, Luxembourg, and Yugoslavia. In 1944, grandfather retired from the diplomatic corps and returned to Army life. He rose to the rank of brigadier general while working with General Eisenhower at SHAPE. His service continued as Adjutant General of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This was followed by President Kennedy appointing him as ambassador to Spain. Sad to say, Grandfather died of lung cancer in 1961, shortly after his appointment. Tony Biddle was a courageous man. He was a patriot and a diplomat. In 1951, Collier's magazine wrote an article about him titled, General Ike's Miracle Man. This article underscores why Tony Biddle was called a diplomat and a charmer, and he was full of life. Our grandfather's legacy continues to inspire diplomats around the world. His life reminds us of the importance of dedication, integrity, and service to both one's country and the broader global community. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is a day in which we're going to explore some issues that draw a lot of attention but need a great deal more. I am very happy every time I get the chance to talk to an audience at Duke. When my wife Maggie and I were coming down from the Bryan parking lot on the elevator, we met two students who looked slightly shocked. And I asked them how it was going. It's the second week, I believe, at university. And they said, well, it's going pretty well. I said, so how about that 20-book reading list you got? They said, yeah, how about that? So we know what it is to have an education at Duke. We know how excellent all of you are, and we greatly appreciate your support today. I am delighted to represent Duke's Rethinking Diplomacy program today to introduce our speaker, whose whole life is a pioneering venture in a woman's place in society, in science's place in policy, and in diplomacy's place in bringing a safe and sustainable global society for our future generations. So in doing so, I'd like to offer a few words of explanation about the Duke Rethinking Diplomacy program. But we have to start with a serious contradiction about human nature. We have the intelligence to look far ahead to see what changes are going to come that will affect human society and the Earth's circumstances. We see that science, which is the art of uncovering reality behind the visible world that is before us, is indispensable to changing the future. The contradiction is that all too often we just talk about that science. We don't turn that science into reality. Part of our work here tonight, the presentation tonight, will be about how to turn that science into reality. One of science's great contributions is to tell us well ahead of time about foreseen dangers. For climate change, in 1856, an American woman scientist, Eunice Newton Foote, showed that a container of air with CO2 in it warmed more quickly than a container without CO2, thus confirming the greenhouse effect 168 years ago. 40 years later, in 1896, 128 years ago, Svante Arrhenius, who is a Swedish scientist, also linked the amount of atmospheric CO2 to atmospheric warming and identified human industrial activity as the main cause. So now diplomacy has to partner with science to turn scientific fact into national and global action. Environmental sustainability in all its aspects is the underlying major challenge for humankind for years to come and lifetimes to come. For perhaps the first time in human history, The solutions to our problems may lie beyond our lifespans. It may take generations and decades to resolve. How long it takes is not clear, but what we do see today, the good news, is that much of the world understands the climate challenges we have and is trying to do something about it. Since 2020, nearly 5 years ago, the Duke Rethinking Diplomacy program, through anticipatory diplomacy, has been helping to drive the process of implementing national and international law and regulation to meet these issues before they overwhelm us. Anticipatory diplomacy has three main features. One, to expand and to deepen global multilateral discussions to agree on actions more quickly. Two, to purposely look farther ahead to recognize new threats and to engage in diplomatic discussions before our differences become crises. And three, to help articulate a strategic approach to the global future for the United States and the world. Now, we did something like this once before in 1945. We created an economic system for the world that has brought unprecedented wealth. In 1950, the world GDP was $10 trillion. Last year, according to one calculation I saw, it topped $105 trillion. Never before in human history has there been a 10-fold increase in global wealth in 75 years. We weren't the only reason, but we were the incentivizing reason. And the current challenge is a little bit like 1945, except that this time we have an entire world that is facing an uphill challenge with unprecedented concerns. We need a plan. We need a plan. Our speaker this afternoon is perfectly placed to talk about how these challenges can be met in the national and international realm. She has extraordinary experience as a negotiator and leader. I won't go over all her bio because you've seen it on the screen, but she has served in many government departments. She is an attorney. She graduated from Columbia Law School with honors, and she has, I will say, tried and succeeded through difficult scheduling challenges to be with us tonight, and I greatly admire that. And by the way, her son-in-law is a graduate of Duke, having graduated, I think, in 2013. So she's one of the family, and she has many connections with this wonderful university. So now please join me in welcoming Monica Medina to our podium. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Pearson, for such a kind introduction. Dr. Zinalda, for inviting me tonight, and to the Biddle family, thank you so much for endowing this lecture series. It seems like it makes a huge contribution to all of you here. What an amazing turnout. Thank you very much for showing up on a beautiful day when you could be outside. I'm thrilled and really honored to be here, and I'm touched particularly by the connection I feel to the same thing that drew Tony Biddle into the Foreign Service and back into service over and over again. It's that initial time I spent in the military that really embedded in me that desire to serve the public. And it's been an honor in my career to have served it in many different ways, and you can read about it in my bio. But anyway, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Today we're facing a triple planetary crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and harmful pollution. How do they rank when compared to today's other foreign policy crises? Even as we watch the tragic events in war-torn areas around the world, these environmental crises are causing ongoing, widespread displacement and suffering, economic losses, food insecurity, and migration. They are fueling further global instability and are only likely to get much worse, as the ambassador has really well explained, unless we redouble our efforts on sustained international cooperation and action. The ultimate global diplomat, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, shares this view. He recently said, "Humanity is waging a war on nature. This is senseless and suicidal. The consequences of our recklessness are already apparent in human suffering, towering economic losses, and the accelerating erosion of life on Earth." When you add in the pandemic, which was also likely a consequence of exposure or spillover from a virus in an animal to a human, there are 4 environmental crises that have upended the lives of millions, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions around the globe just in the last decade. So I ask you, want to see if you could raise your hands if you think our global norms and mechanisms are addressing these challenges. Are they working? Yeah, no hands. I would argue that they are not, and the Secretary General clearly agrees. His statement that I read a minute ago was not an aberration. In June of this year, he said of climate change, "We are playing Russian roulette with our planet. We need an exit ramp off the highway to climate hell. And the good news is we have control of the wheel. The difference between minimizing climate chaos or crossing dangerous tipping points is in our hands. 1.5 degrees, which is the global target for containing climate temperature rises, is not a goal. It's not a target. It's a physical limit. He understands the gravity of the situation. He summed it up this way in 2021 to the UN General Assembly. Quote, "The world must wake up. We are on the edge of an abyss and moving in the wrong direction. COVID-19 and the climate crises have exposed profound fragilities as societies and a planet. Yet instead of humility in the face of these epic challenges, we see hubris. Instead of the path of solidarity, we are on a dead end to destruction." Wow. Urgent crises, life or death consequences, and self-imposed. So if our hands are on the wheel and we are heading off the proverbial cliff, are we doomed? Can we get back on the right track? Can we change? Clearly something is wrong, and diplomacy and cooperation are essential. Making progress is urgently needed, and it's hard. But given the lack of sufficient progress, we must ask ourselves whether current global institutions and norms are working well enough to address these crises. I would submit there is a way forward, and I have hope every day and in the work that I did that we can find it. But it will require us to really look hard at the current institutions that we are living with. So let me begin by telling you what I want you to remember from this talk, if you remember anything. We need new, more flexible paradigms for international cooperation on these quadruple planetary crises. We need a new paradigm, one that can start now, one that is pragmatic, and in which progress is made using tools and institutions that are fit for purpose. So today I'll talk with you a little bit about the spectrum of norms and mechanisms and institutions in use today, including treaties, executive agreements, and more informal tools. And then I'll discuss whether treaties should be the tool of choice for tomorrow's diplomats like you. I will explain why I believe that treaties are not the only way, or even necessarily the best way, to make tangible, impactful, accountable, and lasting progress to address global environmental problems. And then I'll explain why I believe that international executive agreements, as opposed to treaties, can and should be preferred going forward. And I will make one final important point about the United States and global treaties and why we must stop boycotting them. So let's dive in. Take a step back. Look more deeply at these problems and challenges and our assumptions about them. These challenges are real and existential, and they're happening now, and we have frittered away any time to spare in solving them. What are the common threads? The first one is urgency. We must act now. Tomorrow is too late. What are the facts? The physical limits to the planet's functioning. This year was the hottest, potentially the hottest year on record, most likely. the hottest day on record, hottest oceans ever experienced. On biodiversity loss, the 2022 Living Planet report by WWF and the London Zoological Society found that between 1970 and 2018, wildlife populations declined by 69%. Pollution. This year we'll create 220 million tons of plastic waste, and the amount of plastic waste we are creating is increasing every year, and most of it is improperly handled and will remain on this planet for centuries because it doesn't biodegrade. And we know the impacts of pandemics like COVID-19 or Ebola or AIDS or monkeypox, or this week it was the Eastern equine encephalitis that struck in upstate New York. Every day when we don't make progress, we are damaging the planet and ourselves. The second common thread is that global solutions are needed. These are no longer simply local problems or even national problems, and that's the way we used to think about the environment. It's a local problem. But these problems don't respect or even recognize national borders, and they can't be easily contained. Look at COVID-19. They also cannot be solved locally or nationally. Unilateral national action has limited or even counterproductive impact, merely shifting burdens across borders. The third thread that runs through all of these challenges is that they're intertwined and interconnected in mutually reinforcing ways. We cannot address them sequentially or one economic sector at a time. Sometimes regional solutions can help, but really we need global solutions. We must tackle them all together, and soon. And finally, traditionally, governance in this area has been especially weak. The world is more and more interdependent, and yet it's also more fractured thanks to authoritarianism and the erosion of democratic norms. So global governance has never been needed more than it is today, and the tragedy of the commons is playing itself out on a global scale when it comes to nature and the environment. And you don't have to look past the ocean, our air, our atmosphere, shared rivers, or even space, which I know is a real interest here at Duke. The turbulence and instability these challenges are causing is substantial, even if overshadowed. When we look, we see the real problems: food insecurity, climate insecurity, health insecurity, migration, resource grabs, and expansion of all kinds of trafficking and global criminal networks related to conflict. And it's all on the rise, not to mention economic disruptions, premature deaths. Fixing this situation, I believe, requires a major reset, reimagining and re-engineering so much of the way things work in the interconnected world in which we live. So what can we do? What must we change? How do we adapt our approach to foreign policy, diplomacy, and these global institutions? Currently, there are many mechanisms for cooperation on environmental challenges, but the ones that are most often used are either purely voluntary and aspirational, or binding and mandatory. So let's take a look at some examples of each. At one end of the spectrum are these goals and non-binding mechanisms. The most notable of these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The goals were adopted in 2015 after a huge effort to bring all the nations of the world together around a common vision for 2030 and a call to action for the nations of the world to achieve the goals together. There are 17 of them, and they are hard to deny as important. There are important things like ending poverty, reducing inequality, increasing education and health, and spurring economic growth, and of course tackling climate and working to preserve natural resources in the oceans, our forests, and beyond. In these goals, every country must work on its own and is responsible for achieving the nationally determined goals, and reporting on them is totally voluntary. And unfortunately, there's no way to spin these SDGs 9 years later as a success. The United Nations in June of this year did an assessment of them with only 6 years remaining and said it will take a massive increase in investment and major scaling of the few successes in order to achieve them. Of the 17 goals, only 17% are on track to be achieved. There are other types of informal meetings and gatherings, things like the UN Ocean Summit, which is held every 3 years, or the UN Environment Assembly held every 2 years. And they too are important, but they fail to make measurable progress, have measurable accomplishments. But should we give up on these voluntary options and opportunities? I don't believe so, because they drive political will for specific actions, and they are open to all countries, not just those that are members or signers. And that's an important part of why they play a role that is important. The UN Ocean Conferences in the last 6 years helped to develop the impetus for the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ treaty, that must now be ratified. But without those ocean conferences, we wouldn't have found the ways to find solutions to the diplomatic challenges, to the impasses that were a part of the long and drawn-out negotiation. And it was only in the last 6 years, when we had ocean conferences where conversations could be held outside of the negotiating room, that we actually got leaders to commit to completing the negotiation. Similarly, the Global Plastic Agreement that's being negotiated right now was a decision made by the UN Assembly in 2022. The UN Environment Assembly. The UNEA meeting set out a time frame for the negotiation and its broad aims. So these are important, but if this was all we had, we would still fail to meet the moment. At the other end of the spectrum of diplomatic tools, we have treaties. Treaties have long been considered the gold standard in international law because they have the force of law. The countries that ratify and are members of a treaty or convention agree to be legally bound by its terms. And there are many NGOs and many countries that insist that only a treaty will do. Treaties are perceived as tough enough to make the developed countries keep their promises. And given the urgency and the needs that we see, a treaty sounds really good. Force of law is important. I'm a lawyer. Of course I think laws matter. A treaty provides some teeth for getting powerful and wealthy countries to actually live by the agreed-upon rules. But when you look closer, what you see is that sometimes what happens, or often what happens under treaties, is that they don't live up to their hype. There are in fact several ways in which treaties can be ineffectual or undermined. First, treaties take time, and I mean a long time. First to negotiate them, and then to make them actually have impacts. If not, it's not enough for one treaty, or for one country, or even many countries to sign a treaty. Usually the language of the treaty requires that a certain substantial number of countries must ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. And until then, it's just as aspirational as the Sustainable Development Goals. The process can take years. One of the most recent agreements that was treaties that was agreed upon is the Port State Measures Agreement to combat illegal fishing. It took 7 years to enter into force. 78 countries plus the US have now joined, and it's still only marginally effective. Second, treaties cover only those countries that ratify them. Ratification is required, and domestic implementing laws must be passed country by country. So the Port State Measures Agreement went into effect 7 years later, when only 30 countries were bound by its terms. That's less than 20% of the world complying, and it took 7 years. The Areas Beyond, or Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, BBNJ agreement, was signed by more than 80 countries a year ago. People rushed to the table to sign that agreement. But that didn't enter into force. They all had to then go back and ratify it, and a year later, fewer than 10 countries have ratified, and 60 must ratify it for it to enter into effect. And then domestic law needed to implement these agreements can lag. So it takes a long time, and then it's only partially effective when so few countries ratify quickly. Third, countries can provide their own interpretations of how a treaty operates. That doesn't change the treaty for everyone, but it does change it for that country. And there are two ways to do it. One way is to provide a country-specific legal interpretation of the law of the treaty, but even more pervasive or more undermining of the treaty is a reservation of a particular provision, which a country can do under some treaties. It's like an opt-out of the part you don't like. For example, the International Whaling Convention allowed countries to opt out of a moratorium on commercial whaling, which Iceland and Norway, two of the biggest whaling nations, did. Canada, another whaling nation, never even ratified it. They never joined. And Japan, a third large whaling nation, was allowed to interpret scientific permit authority to blow a hole through the treaty that was so large it really undermined its entire effect. Fourth, settling disputes and generally enforcing treaties is a challenge. Most treaties rely on arbitrations for adjudication and dispute settlement. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea is a prime example. It's a real court with real judges and arbitrators. It sits in Hamburg, Germany, and it hears cases, and it does resolve some disputes. But how does that work in practice if a country like China has a reservation under the law of the sea and refuses to abide by the compulsory dispute settlement mechanism? For example, when the Philippines sued China over a crucial territorial dispute in the South China Sea, China simply boycotted it entirely, didn't show up, didn't argue its case, and ignored the ruling. And that actually caused further tension in the region. Thus, what's considered one of the best international treaties, this Law of the Sea Treaty, has been seriously undermined by lack of a real enforcement and adjudicatory mechanism. The U.S. hasn't ratified this treaty, though we recognize parts of it as customary international law. So we abide by it, but we don't get any say in how it operates. Meanwhile, China has ratified, but has a reservation so large you could sail an aircraft carrier through it. Since the time of the Law of the Sea Tribunal decision, China continues to coerce and intimidate Southeast Asian coastal states, threatening the key tenet of the agreement of the treaty itself, the global freedom of navigation for ships, in a critical throughway in the world. The State Department has repeatedly called upon China to stop, but because the U.S. never even ratified the convention, regrettably, our protestations fall on deaf ears. So, what can we do? I believe that all of this system of treaty law, all the system of treaty law does is undermine the faith of rule of law in general, and in international law specifically, when it promises more than it can actually achieve. When these institutions and norms fail, the more they fail, the worse it gets. But I do believe we can overcome the place that we're in, where we're stuck between these voluntary mechanisms and these very hard and perhaps not so realistic treaty mechanisms. But only if we change the paradigm and switch to a system in which international agreements, like the Paris Climate Accord, are used much more often. And it's not simply a question of semantics. There are some real advantages to international agreements. And while they are not considered hard international law, these agreements can be much more impactful than assemblies and conferences and fuzzy goals, and also much more impactful than treaties. I believe that international agreements with modern transparency and reporting can be effective and solve the crises that we are facing in a much more dynamic and flexible way. So let's take a look at each of the drawbacks of the voluntary and treaty approaches and see how international agreements stack up. Agreements can be clear, definitive, and binding. They are signed, and they have real requirements. Impose a global standard, like the one for climate change, the 1.5 degrees. So we all know exactly what we're aiming for. It's not as broad and as vague and fuzzy as the SDGs. And it's much more like a treaty in terms of having teeth and a real international agreement status. In other words, what one country does is noted by other countries, and that country can be held accountable to what it says it will do. Agreements go into effect much more quickly, often immediately, or at least much faster. There's no delay required by ratification or long processes for entering into effect. And there's no requirement that a certain number of countries sign the agreement in order for it to go into effect. Once a country signs, it begins implementation right away, which means that country action and global action can be synchronous. Think about that 7-year delay if it had been applied to the climate crisis. We would have lost so much time, almost the entire time that we've had since the agreement went into effect, waiting for countries to ratify it. Agreements can also provide much more transparency. Implementation is achieved through national action plans that must be written and published. So like the SDGs, they are country-by-country approaches and allow for individual countries to determine the best way for their own nation to proceed. They can and often do include updating domestic international laws as part of the national plans, but they also involve more informal mechanisms like regulations and other approaches to implementation, domestic labeling laws, or reporting requirements to domestic authorities that are then noted by the international community. Agreements are also by their nature flexible without undermining their strength. No one-size-fits-all solution that can actually lead to the standard being lowered to the lowest common denominator. When you negotiate a treaty, every country has to agree to abide by that standard. And so it naturally takes the standard down to the denominator, to the thing that can unify everyone around it. But these custom-tailored national plans can have much more ambitious solutions. And the customizations don't undercut the agreement by creating a double standard. In fact, they create a race to the top. Opt-outs don't undermine the ultimate goal. They just allow for different paths to success. Agreements can provide greater accountability among all parties and bilaterally. They can increase public awareness and potential for enforcement through public demand rather than some court or tribunal. Countries hold each other accountable in ways that are multifaceted. Data is now publicly available, and that kind of public accountability, as opposed to just accountability to a tribunal, is much more potent and much quicker. Look at how public pressure on China got them to crack down on illegal ivory trafficking and close their domestic ivory markets. Public pressure is incredibly effective. Similarly, look at how the U.S. has approached China or India on climate. We have used the climate meetings and U.S. soft power to cajole these countries forward. In the case of China, one could argue that our competition with them for dominance in solar panel or EV markets has made the U.S. even more engaged and more supportive of important solutions for lowering emissions globally. These informal mechanisms within the context of an agreement can be extremely effective because they are self-enforcing. Agreements can also lead to greater cooperation and more cooperation, more effective cooperation. We have COPs, Conferences of the Parties for Climate, every year. And with the Paris Agreement as the starting point, we have made important leaps ahead on things like loss and damages for nations that are most harmed by climate every year. We now recognize that climate and health are connected. That wasn't the case at the beginning, but now there is a climate and health meeting at every COP. Climate and security are also connected, and we have similar get-togethers before, during, and after the climate COPs to address these issues. Oceans and climate connections are recognized. And now ocean plans for climate are found in the National Determined Contributions, NDCs, the National Action Plans. I know there are some people who think that the Paris Accords are weak and have not achieved enough. And I know we are not on track to stay within 1.5 degrees, and we're hoping just to stay close. I know that under an agreement mechanism, countries can withdraw, like the U.S. did with the Paris Accord, or simply stop participating. But they can also start again just as easily. And I believe that on these environmental existential challenges, public pressure and public demand from the developing countries that are so greatly impacted, will keep national governments engaged. But these mechanisms also give civil society, corporations, provincial, and city governments meaningful roles. Why would we always choose a treaty to solve these problems when our global diplomatic resources are already stretched too thin? Why would we, when it is a challenge for so many nations just to attend the treaty negotiations, why would we insist on a treaty? I believe that international agreements can be more than sufficient in most cases and should be preferred going forward and seen as the right answer rather than as a compromise or a failure. Indeed, there are two treaties being negotiated today as treaties that should be agreements in my view. There is a treaty being negotiated on responding to pandemics, and there is a treaty being negotiated on global plastic production and pollution. Both are urgent, complex problems that demand immediate, dynamic, and flexible, but specific responses, depending on the problems have impacted each country. The agreement mechanism would serve the world better, in my view, on these two problems. That said, There are some places or issues for which a treaty makes sense, and two specific ones come to mind. The first is areas in the ocean beyond national jurisdiction, those parts of the world that exist beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zone of countries, outside the long arm of the law of any nation. No long arm statutes really extend out into the farthest parts of the ocean. Deep seabed mining and the newest treaty, the one I mentioned before, BBNJ, are two cases in point where the treaty mechanism makes sense. And the second, I think, is space. It belongs to no nation, and no national laws can reach beyond our atmosphere, much less to the surface of the moon and beyond. I worry most about this one, and so I'm really very glad to see how much work and effort is being put into this particular issue here at Duke. And I do think there is a place for agreements that lead to a treaty that will actually be impactful. For example, we have the Artemis Accords in the US, in which we have gathered many nations in the world to help the US, or to go with the US, to the moon again. And I think that's a wonderful way for us to extend cooperation in space as we build toward a more fulsome space agreement on the moon and Mars and beyond. And I'm not arguing that treaties don't work at all. There is the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with the ozone hole, and it has worked fabulously well and been an incredible mechanism. So I don't think treaties should be thrown out any more than I think these voluntary mechanisms should be thrown out. But I think when it comes to international cooperation and international challenges and solving them, we need to think more about using international agreements as the way ahead. And I want to make one final quick point, because I would love to have a chance to have a conversation with all of you about some of these things. The final point is that the US needs to ratify treaties. We have been stuck in a mode in which we just turn our backs on the treaty mechanism more often than not, because we think we're going to give up US sovereignty by joining a treaty, like the Law of the Sea Treaty. But it is a long time for that to end. We cannot be seen as a global superpower and at the same time pick and choose when and how we will cooperate on global problems. So I believe that when we think about treaties, we should think about them individually and look at their individual provisions and try and avoid those kinds of provisions that impede US sovereignty. Treaties should be fit for purpose, and those adjudicatory mechanisms that may impede on US sovereignty may not be as effectual as we need anyway. So maybe they should not be as important in the treaty mechanism. But that is for each treaty negotiation. So it's hard to predict or to say that it never works. But I think when the U.S. doesn't ratify treaties, we are at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis China, and they're our most important global competitor, and our businesses are at a disadvantage. They don't do well when other countries set the rules of trade and commerce and security. And I can name two examples here. The Global Intellectual Property Treaty and the Deep Seabed Mining Treaty are two examples where U.S. interests are being left out. And I can tell you from experience, when the U.S. has to sit in the back of the room and work through other governments, it's completely against our interest, and it's not in the world's interest either. So Senate engagement, indeed congressional engagement in these international agreements, is too important to be withheld. Congress has an important role to play in shaping our foreign policy when it comes to these agreements, and it should be embraced. Treaties should not be a non-starter for the Senate. So the bottom line is that we need a new paradigm for global cooperation, one that is not all or nothing. Global agreements can and should be calibrated to achieve their ends. One-size-fits-all solutions are not the best approach. Fit for purpose is more important, and so are transparency, data, science, and speed. In the case of urgent and complex global problems, international agreements should be preferred. But when treaties are the best option, the U.S. should ratify them and participate fully in their in their governance. Thank you very much for letting me be here, and I look forward to the conversation, and it's just such a thrill to see this room so packed on a beautiful afternoon. So I look forward to taking your questions and to the conversation with Ambassador Pearson. Thank you.
Can you all hear us up here? Is there any difficulty? Okay, great. Thank you. Monica, thank you very much for that overview of our desires and our frustrations. I want to ask you a question that is hypothetical, but that draws a bit on your talk and your experience. We have a National Space Council chaired by the Vice President. It's a way of pulling together all the players dealing with space in one room, one space, and discussing what way is best to move ahead as a country, a strategy. A two-part question. Is there any impediment to having a national environmental council and have representatives which are spread all over our government, and some of them are small and some are large, but have representatives be on that council? And the tied question to that is, let's imagine that that is true and that the president executes executive agreements. Am I right in saying that an executive agreement doesn't require congressional approval, but in this case it would have to have some congressional support or it would be completely ineffective?
Yes.
So one of the advantages, I'm surmising, of having executive agreements that would still have a congressional input is that those would not require a two-thirds majority vote. They could simply be passed by the House or Senate and made effective in an ordinary legislative way.
That's exactly
So I'm
right.
sorry that's a long and complicated question, but I wanted to get your thoughts on looking forward and how we might be able to better organize government structure to actually improve the way we're trying to operate.
Well, it's a great question, two parts. So the first one has to do with sort of interagency dispute settlement, if you will. You know, how do we set a common goal? Sometimes agencies have missions that are slightly in conflict with one another, and it is important for them to come together and for us to set a policy direction. And that's exactly what happens with the Space Council. There was a big question about how important should it be that we say space should be used peacefully. Copious is an agreement that is already recognized, but we wanted to re-emphasize that point. And it was a question about how to emphasize that and the discussion of the Space Council really mattered, and the Vice President weighed in. And it matters when somebody at that level actually sits in on the process and helps to kind of find a way forward. There is something called the Council on Environmental Quality. It's an office that sits inside the larger confines of the White House and has a chair, sort of like the Vice President. And in the first administration I served in, which will date me now, the Clinton administration, Vice President Gore actually spent a lot of time on the council's work. The CEQ is what it's known as in the government. CEQ was very active, and climate change was one of his most frequent topics. So we had already started to think about it back then, but we weren't doing nearly enough. We were, I think, sort of getting familiar with the problem. But he drove a lot of the work. So really, if a vice president, or in this case, the president himself in this administration, worked very hard on the two signature pieces of legislation that have moved us forward on climate change, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which put together are the single largest piece of climate legislation or single largest climate program ever even conceived of on the planet. And it did make a difference that the president made that a priority from day one. And I worked on his campaign, so it was embedded into our plans as far back as when he started to run. So it matters when that kind of leadership comes to the table and brings agencies together and tries to formulate sort of a policy direction. And that policy direction helps us globally too, because as we reduce our emissions, the other countries around the world feel like we're helping them too, because the impacts are felt globally. Back to that, climate isn't a national problem, it's a global problem. So to the extent we are actually we are on a path to radically change our climate emissions trajectory, we can then go to the world and say, we're trying, we're doing our best, we're working to make the challenges that we're putting on ourselves, because we see it in our country, but also on the world, we're getting those under control. So it's a question of leadership and priorities, and when a vice president or even a president gets involved, it makes a difference. When it comes to the Senate or the Congress, the beauty of executive agreements is that the Congress comes along, members, staff, sometimes members themselves attend treaty negotiations, sometimes sit in the U.S. negotiating strategy sessions. But when they aren't really expected to get ratified, most of the time they sort of they stay back, and they don't engage. And whether it's a treaty or an executive agreement, often we need domestic law to implement. And so their engagement through the entire process, Congress's engagement through the entire process, is really valuable and can help shape the negotiations. If countries say, there's no way I can get that domestic law passed, then it may help to find another way forward, a different path. For example, there's this plastic treaty that's being negotiated right now. Europe and many developing countries want it to be a treaty, and they want a ban on single-use plastics and a significant production cut in new plastic materials. That may be something that Europe can agree to, because they have a very robust regulatory system. It's not something that I think we can ever agree to, because I can't envision a U.S. law that would put those kinds of bans in place. On the other hand, we could, however, set for ourselves a national goal of zero plastic pollution by a certain time, and using our authorities under the standards. There's an agency that creates standards for everything. If they change the standards for the biodegradability of certain materials, or if we created more labeling requirements, those little triangles that everyone sees, they're useless. So there are lots of other ways to get at the problems. And I often say, with respect to plastic, we need a system that's a little bit like our Major Air Pollution Act, the Clean Air Act, which set out two ways for us to achieve lower emissions from cars. One is by making the cars more fuel efficient, and the other was by allowing a state like California to say, we want zero emissions cars. And California actually, without that zero emission requirement, I'm not sure we'd have electric vehicles out in the world today in the numbers that they are, because no one would have tried for that technology. They would have just gone for that better gas mileage technology, the MPG standards improving. It's called CAFE. It's really complicated. But anyway, you get the point. There are different ways of approaching a problem, and sometimes the combination of the two are good. So if Europe says, we want to regulate and we're going to ban this much plastic, and we say we want zero plastic by 2040, this way may spur some technological innovations that we wouldn't have gotten at if we were just trying for here. But this way pushes everybody to try to get to that, at least that lowest common denominator. So I think there are different ways, and Congress could then come in and decide, we want to have a hearing about our standards on recycling and these labels and why they don't work. And just that engagement can change the way the public thinks about and the way we actually deal with some of these problems. I think there's a really important role. And the sad truth is, because it's going to be a treaty, Congress won't take up the plastic agreement. The U.S. won't be a member. We will sit in the back of the room and hope that we can help to impact the results. And, you know, I think a lot of countries look at us and just go, that's just the U.S., you know, or worse. And they think that we don't care about this issue, which is sad because we clearly do. And we have so many innovative companies here in the U.S. making incredibly, potentially game-changing solutions. But they won't get taken up because we won't be at the table. We won't be fully participating. They'll have to go through Germany or through France. And some of those countries just think, well, the U.S. will come along because we're going to regulate it so much in all these other places. They won't have any choice. It's a global market. But we're big. We can do an awful lot on our own. And I worry that we will be sitting out on this one because the rest of the world, some developed countries, Europe, and developing countries believe it must be a treaty. What if it takes 8 years, 10 years for it to go into effect on plastic pollution? Meanwhile, it just keeps piling up. There was a terrible study that came out yesterday that said that there are, you know, untold premature deaths that are coming from the fact that many, many countries have no place to dispose of their plastic, so they burn it. They just burn it. We bury it, and now we're finding forever chemicals that are often in plastic in farms in the Midwest and all kinds of places that we never would have expected it. So to me, it's really important to have public participation. And if we, the U.S., can't be in a treaty, we are selling ourselves short, our public short, the issue short, the world short.
I want to give you in the audience, as many of you, a chance to ask a question if you would like to, given the time. So could you, if you'd like, please raise your hand and please make your question short. Sir.
Thank you, Secretary Medina, Jackson Ewing, Duke University Nicholas Institute. I share your fondness for the Paris Agreement, and I wonder what your views are on some of the additional measures that could be taken to compel or incentivize other countries and any country in the system to meet their goals or to create more ambitious NDCs. And here I'm thinking about things like carbon border adjustments, things like results-based financing for energy transitions, things like potential tariff measures or the creation of carbon clubs that would create trade incentives for compliance, things like that. Thanks.
Yes, all of it. We need it all. On climate, we need it all. And I think the fact that the Paris Agreement leaves open all of these, instead of focusing us on one or two pathways to get our emissions down, let's close every coal plant, right? I mean, we need every single kind of mechanism. And if you've been to the COPs, you know what they're like. It's 100,000 people converging on a place in order to try to find either a business connection or a small cooperation that could happen between countries. Or if you're Secretary Kerry or now John Podesta, the climate negotiator, many backroom meetings with the Chinese trying to get them to make progress. So I think, you know, having said that we can't just rely on sustainable development goals and blah-de-blah, the Paris Agreement and these meetings that happen annually are really important mechanisms for finding every one of those kinds of ways forward. You know, do I think we in the U.S. are going to do a border adjustment tax? Seems unlikely. But Europe, great. And our companies will get more accustomed to that, and maybe someday that's something that people will see as acceptable here. We'll get the political will to do that. In the meantime, can we be innovative in finance? Absolutely. Can we help to bring solutions to countries that need them desperately now? 100%. Our agriculture, our agriculture industry is developing new seeds that can germinate with much less water, or new other types of agricultural products. I was working in the Republic of Congo, and we were, the organization I was leading then was working to bring what I used to affectionately refer to as chubby chickens. The chickens in the Republic of Congo are scrawny little things, and they don't feed people very well. But if you can grow chickens in a place that it's a rainforest, so there's not a lot of food for chickens to eat. But if you can grow chickens that can feed people more, more effectively, bigger chickens, that's great. And there are all kinds of innovations like that can happen. And I have found the climate COPs to be overwhelming, but essential. I think the Paris Accord, if we had tried to have it be a treaty, the U.S. wouldn't have joined. What would that look like? Just imagine that. We'd still probably be waiting for it to enter into effect, or maybe it would have just gone into effect. Think of the time we would have lost in terms of cooperation. So I think it's actually been as much of a success as anything could be on this really challenging problem.
Thank you. Gentleman with the baseball cap on back there. It's Taylor Swift.
Felix Dodds. I mean, I think some of this is interesting because you talked about the Montreal Protocol, and in fact, the Senate passed the Giguère Protocol
Yes.
a couple of years ago with Republican support, so it can be done. The problem is that in most parliaments don't require
The supermajority.
the supermajority, and so that's where we're trying to deal with something with the American problem that other countries don't have. But the other thing is that the whole idea around what you're suggesting actually came out of the Johannesburg summit in 2002. It was the type 2 agreements that we would go off, do partnerships, and the methane pledge, which the US was involved with very much, was a great example of that. But, some countries aren't waiting for the plastic convention to happen. China will have, by 2025, banned single plastic
They'll
use.
still make it, though,
Well,
and send it to us.
Well, we'll have to see about that. That's a trade issue. And that's the other thing with the Montreal Protocol. It had a trade,
Yes.
an enormously great leadership by the US to get in the first
Yes.
place. And that's the same for the CITES convention that you talked about before. So if you can write conventions with trade agreements, then you can have an impact. But the approach has been to go for a framework convention, which then gets everybody in, and then you ratify it through, or you get the targets through the protocols. And that is, as you say, takes a long time.
Thank you.
So, great comment. And yes, the Montreal Protocol, huge success, but it really was aimed at one series, one type of chemical. So it was a very simple, relatively straightforward approach. And then we found out, oops, the substitute wasn't good either. So we had to have the Kigali Amendment. It took 20 years for the U.S. to ratify the Kigali Amendment. And I will say that was a very concerted strategy for Republicans to lead and business to lead, because it had become so apparent that U.S. businesses were being left out of future opportunities because they weren't at the table. But if I had said that, I probably wouldn't have been able to get it ratified. So I was very quiet during that time, and so was President Biden and our entire administration. And we were very glad that the Chamber of Commerce was so engaged on the issue and was willing to expend the resources. But it was a rare situation, and we were 20 years behind. And so maybe the plastic agreement will happen, and 20 years from now, we'll join it. But boy, that doesn't seem like a great thing. And CITES has worked well, but the Convention on Biological Diversity we have never ratified. And I sat in the back of the room. The U.S. is the largest donor nation when it comes to biodiversity funding around the world. We are the largest donor through the Global Environment Facility, and we sit in the back of the room and hope that our voice can be heard. Luckily, there was at the time of the last CBD COP, and there's another one coming up in about a month, the last CBD COP, the world adopted a huge goal 30 by 30, 30% of the planet protected by 2030 in order to conserve species all over the world and save ourselves. Really important goal. If the US hadn't contributed the funding it had, we wouldn't have made the number that the developing countries were looking for in terms of financial contributions to help get there, because developing countries are the ones with biodiversity. So it was really important for us to participate, but it was challenging, and it was only because a group of ministers from around the world, from developed and developing countries, created a small little WhatsApp group. And we were able to work through some of the challenges and push through that framework agreement, even in the face of lots of hurdles and all-night negotiating sessions. So, but I will also say one last thing, which is trade agreements can be extremely effective. And so at this moment in time when we're not doing so many trade agreements, it's a little bit of a challenge to use them. But we had these great side agreements, environmental side agreements with some of the countries with which the U.S. has trade agreements, like the U.S. and Chile have one, and there's one for Central American countries in the U.S. And those environmental side agreements were incredibly effective regional or bilateral mechanisms for achieving specific environmental results and supporting those nations in a way that was very beneficial to the U.S.
Could I have a student, please? Yes.
Thank you so much. As you mentioned, China is the greatest global producer of solar, EVs, also of wind turbines and other green tech and green energy products. How do you weigh the economic costs of Chinese overproduction in this sector with the global benefits of greater accessibility and affordability of green products?
Boy, that is a big question. Do we need all of these things? Yes. Do we want them to be flooding the market with them? And what I worry the most about with all those things, and I'll come at it from my perspective, I'm not really an energy czarina. I didn't really focus so much on the energy policy parts. But I worry about the natural resources required for the batteries and the amount of environmental damage we will do flooding the market with those products and flooding the market with those critical minerals needed for those products that will leave countries polluted because mining is not a clean process. The rush to deep seabed mining in order to create those is really a challenge. So for me, the way to help fix that problem is to stop the resource grab, the natural resource grab, the gold rush, if you will, for critical minerals, and try and develop systems of recycling those minerals and recycling those products so that we don't just, where are we going to put all those wind turbines when they fall apart? We have to think about that now. And that's why I love what I hear from students who really think about design and the long term much more than we did, say, when I started in this work. So to me, there is a challenge there. China does want to rush in, flood the market with cheaper versions that they're paying for by leaving a polluted mess somewhere, an illegal, using products that are illegally mined or whatever. We have to crack down on that and create a system that's far more sustainable and think about sustainability as we design this new energy system.
Another student, please, and then the gentleman with the Argyle socks. Student? Giovanni, could you help me out there? Okay, thank you.
Hello. My question is, obviously after the U.S. passed the Inflation Reduction Act, you heard complaints from Europe about the protectionist measures that were included in there.
Yeah.
So my question is, how is protectionism changing conversations about international climate cooperation, and how will it change our relationship with our allies with regards to cooperating on climate?
Well, it's sort of a twist on the last question. I think, a little bit of unwinding of this. Well, I'll take another step back. One of the things that was striking about the pandemic was how these globally interconnected markets and all the efficiency that we created was sort of spinning out of control and we couldn't really see it. So now, trying to wind that back a little bit, it seems to me that a certain amount of protectionism is one way to put it, but sort of we're going to build it here and use it here is also not so bad in terms of sort of cooling the demand and this global sort of desire to make products cheaper and faster and commercialism in general. You know, I'm not so bothered by protectionism, particularly because then we worked it out with the EU, who was pretty mad. But you know, that's when diplomacy can help to smooth some of those issues. And to me, it's not such a bad thing that we make our. I mean, I think energy independence is a really important thing for U.S. Security, and so you know that we are slightly more interested in being protectionist, if you will, isn't such a bad thing. It's a balance.
Sir,
Do I need a mic or no?
it's, if your voice carries.
So this is a question, when you began your long distinguished career, compromise was an active form of work in the United States specifically.
Those were the
And there's
days.
been the dissolution of that. And so I wonder globally, as people look at us, because Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson spoke
yeah.
across a page auditorium when they were touring the country to talk
Yeah.
about Simpson Bowles. And one of the questions was, how are we doing, we being the U.S.? And Bowles, who has tremendous wit, said, we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. So I'm wondering how people, the sort of global market feels about, we talk a lot about, and we know the disaster ahead, but I'm wondering how the world is looking at us. We have trouble compromising here. So what is your feeling about the global compromise in these issues?
I will say a couple things here, and I'll save the most political for the end. The world still needs us. And I will talk about the BBNJ agreement, the Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement. It had been in works for a long time. And I showed up at the State Department and said, we got to get this done. You know, it's time. The world is waiting on us. We need protected areas in the ocean. We need to be able to share the resources of the ocean that really belong to everybody. And people looked at me like I was a little bit crazy. And we showed up. So I said, I'm going to go. And they're like, no, Assistant Secretary, go. And we were there twice, all through the night, once in September, and then it took us another 6 months. China and Russia really were not ready, and so they and their allies slowed down the process. But at the end, the U.S. really played an important role in helping to find the language that got us to that agreement. And it's sad to me that we won't be able to ratify it. So I think, you know, countries look to us to be there to help bridge some of these things. And in the end, even Russia relented. And Russia was blocking everything and really was quite just sort of, you know, they didn't care. They just, you know, they're obviously global cooperation not high on their list. You know, but if everybody else agreed, they had to come along, and they did in the end. We got enough countries in the G77 that could make China see, can't go against them any longer. So China came along, and once that happened, we got it. We got the agreement done. That said, I think the people I talk to in other countries, and I still do a lot of traveling around. I'm a fellow at Conservation International now, and there's a lot of worry about what happens in this election and what the U.S. will do and what it means and what having an administration that thinks that the State Department is, you know, sort of full of people from the deep state and doesn't respect the intelligence community and the information that makes us smart as we look at the world and think about how to be a good country in that world. So I do worry, and they're worried.
Student, please. Someone? Could you hand this? Okay, yes, go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Enya Wei. I'm a second-year student at the Sanford School. Thank you so much for being here. I used to work at OES right before you came, so really grateful for your leadership there. You have a wealth of knowledge doing work across the federal agencies, and I'm curious, especially for some of the agencies that are not as obviously tied to environmental issues like the DOJ, how exactly could they take a larger role in some of the leadership? I think, for example, the military has played an impressive role in some of the innovations related to GPS and other things that obviously do have relevance in our daily lives. And so from this experience that you've had in working across different agencies, what are some of the bigger roles that some of the other agencies could have?
It's a great question. And it's one that we thought about in the transition time for preparing for the Biden administration, was how could we put not just climate, but environment and environmental justice, how could we make that part of the entire fabric? We had a whole of government approach. And so every agency thought about it, not just because of their own agency operations, like the military installations that are being inundated by sea level rise, or the housing complexes that, or the approach towards housing, towards incentives to make energy efficiency in public housing, for example. We thought about how could we, because it's so important and it matters in every sphere of life, from education to transportation, housing, small businesses, everything. And I honestly think, while that may have seemed political because it was a Biden administration really viewpoint, it is sort of going to be part of what the federal government does from here on out, because it is such a impactful, because it is having such impact on our world. And it may be that not everybody is the victim of a fire or a hurricane or a flood, but communities all around the country are being impacted. And the government has to be there at those places. That's the essential role of government, is to help people when they're in their time of need, defend them, make sure that when they're in danger, they're protected or they're saved. So it's just, I think it's there now. Every agency will be thinking about climate change and environmental issues more broadly, because they impact people and they are hurting. The essential governmental function is health, is safety, right? Is protection and spreading the risk and helping people who are having a hard, time for whatever reason, and that's what every agency is going to do. And in fact, if our economy grows because we are, creating a more sustainable future, that's great too. So even the Commerce Department, not just NOAA, but the rest of the Commerce Department, and the emphasis on chips and science, really so valuable. Kind of collectively, we couldn't have weather forecasts if we didn't do it as a government. There's some things that are just really effectively done at the governmental level. And when you go to countries that don't have that, you see the difference.
This gentleman, yes, right here.
Thank you so much for all your service.
Oh, no.
Medina,
My pleasure.
I sense also a little bit of conflict on all your experience, and I want to ask you if you can comment on that kind of conflict as a person that had served so deeply within the government in many aspects and dimensions, but also as a global citizen that, as you show us, believe in global governance, in the architecture of the United Nations and what is happening there with all the problems, political problems that we have and that we see there. But also as a member of non-governmental organizations. I want you to comment on that conflict of being an insider, participating, right? But also being a member of the civil society, representing that, and seeing which conflicts are there happening, because there are all sorts of unintended consequences for policies that are protectionist of a country, that create global inflation and things like that probably go against the will of the policy itself to put us in a better environmental space. And then we have COP28 in Dubai with the participation of the private industry, with oil, all sorts of things that I think you have been witnessing, and we can see a little bit of that view in your presentation. Thank you very much for all what you are doing.
You're so kind, and it's a great question. And I think that's why lawyers have a role to play in and public policy in general. But the skill you learn, particularly as a lawyer, the whole point of it is to resolve conflicts. But it's about conflict. You're right there in the conflict. So you learn to be comfortable in that space. And I will say, when I was the U.S. Commissioner to the International Whaling Commission, I had just been an NGO on the outside, looking in and trying to be constructive and help the Bush administration at the time come up with policies that might make the IWC, this little international body that was pretty dysfunctional, try to function a little bit better. And then there I was, the commissioner. All of a sudden, I really wasn't expecting that. And one of the meetings, the NGO community decided that the U.S. government was trying to compromise, back to this compromise question. We were trying to compromise with the whaling governments, and so we were evil. So they made this little cartoon sheet, and I was Cruella de Vil, and somebody else was, they had these, they made us cartoon characters, and I laughed and framed it. I'm like, awesome, do what you have to do. I respected the fact that they were going to be critical, and I didn't take it too personally. Even though Cruella de Vil was pretty hard. But I didn't take it too personally because that's their job, and they were just trying to get the best outcome they could from their perspective. And so one thing is not letting it get to you that you're in the middle of this crisis and this conflict. And the second thing is empathy. Is just always thinking about how does it look to the other side. If you can put yourself in their shoes, it makes such a difference. And when they know you're doing that and they can sense that you care about what matters to them, that's the essence of diplomacy to me, is sort of understanding that conflict is part of what you're going to walk into. Hopefully it's not armed conflict. That's the whole point, is to avoid that. And there's just way too much of it in the world right now, that kind of, irresolvable armed conflict.
I would say let's go at two more questions from students, please. And then, so 1 and 2, so you have some questions.
Hello, I'm Connor Ennis. I am a freshman right now. And so basically, I would love to work in your field. And when I saw that you were coming and read your bio, I sort of got stars in my eyes, if I'm being honest. But my question, as someone
I'm so lucky to have had these chances, really. Honestly, I feel so blessed.
So my question, as someone who wants to get involved in this environmental policy field and learn about it in the future, is how do you square the urgency of the climate crisis with respect for political processes and compromise and the process of the law and the slow-moving nature of bureaucracy and government? Because it seems like we have to work within those frameworks, even if we know it's going to be slow. So how do you deal with that sort of contradiction, given the urgent nature of this crisis?
Just keep your eye on the finish line, where you think we need to go, and continue to push to get as close to it as you possibly can. And through principled leadership, and that's listening, but also moving, not being afraid to take decisions. So again, back to this BBNJ agreement, they came to me and said, well, you want to change the U.S. government's position on some of these things. And I said, well, who are our allies on this agreement, on worrying about property and, how are we going to share and this is serious. It's not that it wasn't important. It was really serious. But if our whole answer was, no, we're not going to agree to anything, which it had been, we don't want to have to worry about how to share the intellectual property of biodiversity, literally the genomic information coming out of whatever is scooped out of the ocean, what we call wet samples. There's so much life in the ocean, we don't even know all of it. So, but if our whole answer was, well, we just want to go out there and take it for ourselves and our businesses and we aren't willing to share, we're going to block this whole treaty, the whole thing's going to fall apart, and we're going to continue to have this tragedy of the commons. Who's on our side? And they said, well, Russia and China. I was like, well, you know what? What does that say? We can't be there. We want to be productive, and we want to protect our industry, so we will have a way for our businesses and our universities like Duke to go out and do research and collect samples. And we have preserved a way for companies that take that information and turn it into the cure for male baldness or diabetes or whatever it is. They will still get the value. But researchers in a faraway country who may also have a good idea about how to use that sequence data, that very basic data that came from a place that doesn't belong to any country, will also have a chance to use that. So, I just kept thinking, how do I persuade people? So I went to the head of the Patent and Trademark Office and I said, here's what we want to do and here's how. And so we worked through it. And we were able to get their support for that agreement. So some of it is listening and figuring out what's the essential thing that they need and what do you need, and is there a place where these two things can come together? Again, and thinking outside the box sometimes. Really just, is there some other way that we haven't thought of? And that's the hardest thing because that's unknown. And in bureaucracies and governments, that's often the hardest thing to do. But, with principled leadership and people who, mean well and want to work things out and want to see the government function, want to see these, international agreements happen, I think it's possible. I really do.
So one last question. So please, and then, thank you.
My name's Trevor Darr. I'm a freshman, and so I wanted to finish today by asking you a question about the Artemis Accords.
Oh, great.
And so when a lot of the principles of the Artemis Accords, whether that's the proper extraction of resources in compliance with the Outer Space Treaty, the de-weaponization of space, they're what I'd like to call all or nothing principles. It's not a matter of mitigation like a lot of climate agreements are. It's a matter of prevention. And the moment that seal is broken, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It'll stay that way arguably for all posterity. But when actors like China and Russia, countries which, as you said earlier, global cooperation is not exactly a priority, don't comply to it, then arguably the entire agreement is pointless. So how do you see making these countries have these utilitarian internationalist obligations feasible in the next decade, in the critical period?
What I would say, it's a great question. First of all, thank you to the Duke community for having the foresight to think ahead, to anticipate that space is going to be a major diplomatic challenge and a place where diplomacy is needed more as much as anywhere, because if we can get ahead and find ways to bring about the right governance structures, it will make a huge difference. Yes, I think it is challenging when China and Russia have their own ideas. But we in the US just keep signing up more countries for the Artemis Accords. And they just, the more we spread the sort of the way that we think it ought to go, the more countries we get aligned with us, the more likely it is that others will have to, again, through public pressure, through, China used to love ivory. And then when it became something that they had to do in order to keep up with the US and do the right thing, we did a big ivory crush, and 6 months later, they did a bigger one. It was great. So it's really a question of trying to find ways to incentivize that race to the top as opposed to the race to the bottom. And we were talking about this last night, Ambassador, about sort of thinking about, instead of thinking about all the ways that things could go wrong or all the things you have to do to protect yourself, think about what does the future that you want look like, and then design backwards from that.
With this high note, look up. Thank you very much for all the patience. You have been here for almost 2 hours, so yes. Congratulations, Monica, and congratulations, Ambassador Pearson. Thank you very much, and I look forward to see you in 2 years. Thank you. Thank you.